You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at JaysAnalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer.
I have with me probably the best geopolitical talk radio show that you could find, far better than anything like Rush Limbaugh or Hannity or any of those characters, is the guy who I think on a consistent basis really tears them apart and gives a much more accurate presentation of hotbeds, hot zones like the Middle East. And Patrick Henningsen joins us today. He's just recently returned from a trip to Beirut, Lebanon, I believe. Patrick, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you very much, Jay.
Thank you for coming back. I'd like to, first of all, tell us about your trip. Tell us some of what you saw, some of the on-the-ground action. I know that you reported on that on Sunday Wire, but probably some of my listeners didn't get to hear that. What was your feel for what you saw on the ground there?
It was it's always an interesting trip going over to the Middle East, and Lebanon's probably one of the most fascinating countries, not just because of the history and because of the wars and the conflicts, but the culture and the number of civilizations that are kind of layer-caked in a place like Lebanon, in that part of the world. And, it's a small state. It's just, maybe this slightly bigger than, one of the small eastern states like New Jersey or Rhode Island. But it has so much within it, very densely populated. And, we originally planned to use it as a staging ground to have a trip and go into Syria. And we had it all arranged. We had done it through the proper channels. And at the last minute, the group, the press group we were with, basically, they all could go in theory, but there were two Americans. And they were told by our liaison that there will be no visas issued to any Americans for the next month or something like that. So they were concerned for security reasons. So this is what happens in Syria. The security situation changes by the minute, basically. So we then set out to explore what we could in Lebanon, and it was amazing. It was amazing. I got very involved in some of the local artists as well, musicians and graffiti artists. Met geopolitical analysts, met some of the top journalists in the world, interviewed them on our show. We brought a live kit, basically put together a live studio that I had spoken to the alternate current radio networks technical person, and I said I want a broadcast solution that I can fit in a backpack. I didn't want anything bigger than that. So I want everything that can go in a backpack. We can do a live broadcast in studio with guests, with individual microphones and a mixer and everything. And I need to do it for under $500, ideally. And so we came up with a solution. We developed it, and we got the parts, and we road tested it here in Arizona. And then I took it with us on the road, and we did four shows. I'm not sure. I think four live shows in Lebanon on the road. It was amazing. I was doing things I couldn't even do here in Arizona. It was great.
Yeah, for the most part, it was crisp and clear. We heard you loud and clear on our side. Now, for those who are listening might not know, of course, Lebanon and Israel border Syria to the south, as well as Jordan. And so I'm guessing was the plan to make it were you trying to get to Damascus, or did you think you'd get all the way to Aleppo, or what was the plan?
It was to go to Damascus and then Palmyra, which is recently liberated. Mm-hmm. And the group that went after us did manage to do that. Mm-hmm. And we syndicated some of their work on 21st Century Wire. And I'll make another attempt to go again, and as a member of the press in the next couple of months, hopefully. If not, it might have to be later in the year.
Well, of course,
But
this easier, safer route is that you could always just fly to Atlanta to some CNN studios, perhaps, and you could just stand in front of a green screen and put a helmet on. And
yeah,
you're over.
yeah, yeah, that's a good one too. One of the CNN so-called reporters, her name is Clarissa Ward, and she looks like she's straight. I mean, she just appears to me like she's straight out of Langley, but very much a cold, calculated sort of international correspondent and an ice queen, if you will. And she was CNN was boasting 2 months ago she was the only Western journalist in Syria, and they had these shots of her in the back of a taxi, and she had a badaya on, which is a full black, cover,
Hmm.
and which you don't really need in Syria. It's not Saudi Arabia, but apparently she was there and behind rebel lines, and they never really had any clear shots of her on the street. So I assumed she was just riding around in Turkey in the back of a taxi with a cameraman, and then they got their camera footage given to them by Al Nusra Front or whoever CNN works with, I don't know, or whatever so-called rebel groups they get their footage from, because as one would know by now, I would hope that all the terrorist groups and fighters and the Al-Nusra Front, the Ashar al-Sham, and all these groups are ubiquitous amongst rebel-held territories.
Sure.
So, and they packaged this up and edited it, and to much fanfare on CNN, and rolled it around the clock for a couple of days in March, I think, and then made a big deal about how brave she was and this and that. I can't confirm whether she was in Syria. It's very difficult to tell, and my guess is that she wasn't. And the reason is because those areas are under sort of airstrikes at that time by the Russian Air Force and by the Syrian Air Force, and you could say would supposedly by the U.S. coalition, but they don't seem to hit very many targets with regards to ISIS for some reason. So, but again, this is what CNN, this is what the mainstream media does. They stage events in places like Syria. I think Richard Engel, a so-called award-winning journalist from NBC, was part of a staged fake kidnapping. And they made a big deal about this. Was back in 2012,
Yeah.
and this was to help get the ball rolling in terms of getting people to view the government led by Bashar al-Assad as an evil entity. And NBC did this whole kidnapping hoax. And they claimed, Engel and others claimed, oh, we didn't know it was a hoax at the time. And, come on. I don't know whether to believe them or not. I just know the whole thing was proven to be fake.
Well, she wears a full burqa, which I think is a bit ridiculous. She looks like she's wearing a costume in
Yeah.
supposed undercover footage, which makes for good theater, I guess. But she's also the recipient of the DuPont Award from Columbia University. Now, everybody knows that Columbia University, I think, that's a hotbed for CIA recruitment. It's pretty much a CIA university. So here's the supposed journalist who's, quote, undercover for CNN. I mean, that's just utterly ridiculous. There's not going to be any truth telling involved in this.
No, it's not. And so when you're sneaking, even if she snuck into the country illegally, she's in a terrorist-held area who are getting weapons from the United States. I mean, tell me what part of this is not corrupt and criminal? What part of this is not flying in the face of international law? What is going on in terms of the covert war in Syria, the dirty war, essentially?
I watched that clip a minute ago, actually. It's funny you said that, but I was like, what is this CNN reporter doing running around in this burqa, I suppose?
Yeah,
Really weird.
it's just staging. It's just like they dress up. I watched a PBS documentary recently about Yemen, and again, they had this very beautiful, looks like Arab American journalist. I don't have her name in front of me. And she also wore a full burqa as well. And she's going around, they film her filming. And like the camera she has is quite small, but there's obviously a big rig filming her. So it's just fake, the whole production. And they're showing the side from the Saudi, they're calling it the resistance, but this is the Saudi-backed and U.S.-backed militia fighting with the Arab Emirates and possibly Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, against the so-called Houthis which they say are, the taking over the country, when in fact this is the people of Yemen basically resisting Saudi and U.S. Led airstrike bombing of their country, total illegal with regards to international law. And so PBS has sent their crack team in there to help to shape the narrative for U.S. audiences. And if I didn't know the facts on the ground in Yemen, I would believe everything in that documentary. I would think that this woman is an honest filmmaker, and but she's absolutely, seems to me, under orders to basically give one side of the story and do it in such a contorted way that the average viewer has no chance whatsoever, if they have no background on this conflict. Well, which it's a blackout in Western media on Yemen, by the way. Then you will be completely brainwashed to take whatever the CIA or the State Department's choice talking points would be for that conflict.
Well, here's a great question for you. I think you're probably the perfect guy to clear this up. And one of the reasons that it gets confusing for people in America especially is that if you search this kind of material and you want to try to learn about it and figure stuff out, especially if you run to the mainstream sources, you'll get, for example, this LA Times. It says, in Syria, militias armed by the Pentagon are fighting those that are armed by the CIA.
Yeah.
So maybe you could give us some clarification on how the LA Times puts this kind of stuff out, and how this, of course, just fuddles up the American mind. Can you clear that up for us? What exactly is going on there?
Yeah. So this is part of the PR strategy, the general communication strategy with a multifaceted, multi-layered, multifaceted conflict like Syria, which is more complex than anything we have seen in history, period. Okay, this is more, there's more obfuscation going on. There is more distraction going on. So this is called a strategy of confusion in public relations terms. So what they'll do is they have good cop, bad cop. John Kerry will be the good cop playing the diplomat, and meanwhile Ash Carter will be saying inflammatory things about the Russians and how they're allied with Assad, and how bad that is, and it's made the civil war prolonged and attracted the terrorists into Syria. So they do this constantly. So what the LA Times is doing there is, if you look at this like an onion, the top, they're peeling off one layer of the onion, which is that the top layer of the onion is the U.S. is basically flooding that region with arms and weapons, lethal and non-lethal aid to rebel and terrorists, okay? And so they're giving you that first layer. They're showing you what's under the first layer. They're not, however, showing you what's under the second layer. So by doing that, it's kind of a pressure release exercise. It's letting some steam out of a story that is really about to explode, okay? And they do this strategically. They use mainstream media outlets to do this, and these are all the major newspapers: the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, and the broadcast networks. And so what they're not telling you, however, is they're trying to say that, oh, it's the government again. They're so incompetent. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. Now, that may be true to some degree, but this is also a popular meme that was perfected under the George W. Bush administration.
Exactly.
Yeah. That how could the government, be involved in 9/11? How could the government be doing this, doing that? Because they're so stupid and inadequate. And so what the LA Times is basically furthering this meme and saying, oh, the Pentagon is giving guns to the rebels, the moderate rebels, and the CIA is giving weapons and that are falling into the hands of the al-Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda in Syria. So the person reading that is going to step back and say, oh, it's the dumb government again. They don't know what they're doing. They can't manage it. Oh, it's a mess. It's a quagmire. Move along. The truth of the matter is this: there are multiple agencies working with multiple terrorist groups, and we have special forces embedded with terrorist fighting groups, okay? And these will be under contracted and paid through third-party security and mercenary firms.
That's what I was going to say, mercenaries, yeah.
And this will be run out of places like Dubai, and run out of Qatar, and run out of Turkey, and Jordan, perhaps, I don't know, and Israel. Israel is a great. I mean, if you're a mercenary and you want to do training, either weapons training or hand-to-hand combat training or survival training, Israel is a great destination. There's a number of venues there which you can go and do that, and so that's right in the area, and then you're a hop, skip, and a jump from the conflict zone. So this is the facts of the matter. Okay,
Now,
so yeah.
let me ask you this: is it also true that this report talks about firing back and forth between people that are supposedly being armed by the same side? And you mentioned the factionalism, and uh, I think it was someone, I don't recall who, but they were talking about their experience in Iraq during Desert Storm, and they were saying that, or maybe it was Afghanistan, I don't recall, but they were saying that you would get people who would basically just flip sides based on paychecks. So, there's not a whole lot of real commitment to ideology by a lot of these persons, which I guess you're calling a mercenary.
Yeah.
So is a lot of that what's going on too in the background to all these sects and political divisions that it's basically two sides ultimately, right? With, the Western backed Qatar, United Arab Emirates backed, Turkey backed support for the jihad against the Syrian government with Assad, correct?
Yeah, yeah. You would see this, and anytime you bring people into a situation, whether and it's a work situation or it's a military situation or a political situation, there is a certain percentage of people that are basically available for the highest bidder, if they feel they're good at their job. And this will be some of the best fighters and some of the most skilled combat people and people with weapons know-how and people who can train other people. They're available to the highest bidder. These are the most effective tools in the arsenal at the end of the day. And so that's exactly what's happened. And also working conditions. If working conditions aren't so hot with one group or on one side, and you have a friend or you meet people working for another group, and they say, "Oh, it's much better over here. We got 3 squares and three hots and a cot. We've got women on the side, and the cash is paid every week or every month or whatever, or straight into your bank account in Istanbul or Switzerland or wherever, or Panama, or who knows, or New York City," then you will move to where the best deal is. And so it on that level, for I would say a fairly large percentage, more than people might want to admit, that is the case. It's not an ideological fight. If you cut the money off, if you cut all the money off and all the perks given by the U.S. Coalition members to these fighters who are running amok in Syria, how long do you think they would stay fighting? Are they going to do it for God and country? And I don't think so. They'll be gone as soon,
Sure.
as soon as they could find an exit. They would go for it, or basically drop their arms and disarm, basically, which was what happened with a large number of people in Homs, in a major city in central Syria. There was a reconciliation agreement between the government, which was not talked about at all in the Western media. It was blacklisted, that story. There's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's a whole department in the government who's doing this, and many people who had taken up arms have put down arms, and they've been invited to the table to work out a political solution along a timeline, which is difficult to say how long that timeline is, considering all that's happened to that country. But why is this not being reported in the Western media? It's being completely ignored because the Western media and the U.S. State Department and its allies are not interested in the public hearing anything about any of these stories that might puncture or damage the narratives they have worked so hard and spent so many billions of dollars to carefully craft over the last 5 years surrounding the story in Syria.
Well, that's why it's only 60 years later that we learn about various CIA coups that took place in Syria in the 40s, 50s, 60s. There's a whole plethora, a whole list of these that the CIA backed for many years, switching parties, supporting Ba'athist, supporting jihadists using the Muslim Brotherhood and so forth, MI6 trying to assassinate top Syrian leaders in 1957. And what I found interesting about researching that topic, which I don't want to get too far abreast from what we're discussing, but it was called Operation Wapen in 1957, and this was part of MI6's plan to assassinate three leaders in Syria that were amenable to Russia. And so what happened was this led to the model of what's called they call it the Syrian Working Group. This model of coup is the model that would be used, or was the model that was used, excuse me, in Guatemala, Iran, and Indonesia. So the CIA used the exact same strategy of coup in those places as it did in their working group report in 1957, using the Muslim Brotherhood to aid whoever they wanted to come to power at that time. At that time, I believe it was the Baathists. Or excuse me, in the 60s it was the Baathists, but early on it was Arab nationalism. So the reason I bring all that up is that it's pretty much the exact same thing today.
Yeah, yeah. It's a history repeating itself in a different form, with slightly different actors, and the battlefield is very different. I think the biggest difference, everything that you just described there, which was kind of going on behind the curtain, as it were, in those operations in the 1950s. So that's going on behind the curtains today. I think the difference is people in Syria or in countries like Libya, Egypt, and Lebanon. They're a lot smarter. They're more wise to the world. I would hope the Iraqis would be by now, but that's debatable. But you'd think that generally many countries are more wise to the various methods of subterfuge, because they have looked and studied and taken an honest look at history, and realized the amount of destruction, and understood the various ways which Western intelligence agencies would be undermining their civic life, undermining their government structures, undermining their society as a whole, in order to destabilize, subjugate, and control it. But the difference between back then and now is we have a digital media apparatus, a hydra, which the establishment and the government, along with intelligence agencies and then private actors, private financiers, Wall Street billionaires, have basically taken hold of sections and developed whole quadrants of digital media in order to create what they call social engagement around any number of foreign policy objectives. And they will repackage this as a humanitarian operation or a humanitarian issue. And they'll put it out to the millennials. They'll share it on Facebook. They'll vote for it in their polls on websites like avaz.org. And these are all part of the same corporate collective of social entrepreneur websites run by, managed, the public relations and marketing is done by a company out of Manhattan called Purpose. And there's a few other companies in there like that do website design and so forth. You can tell the websites all look the same. And then the funding is coming from the Open Society Institute, Freedom House, and working through these large NGOs. Human Rights Watch are also funded by these same sources, which a lot of it tracks back to George Soros, who the Wall Street Hungarian-born billionaire. So he's basically, I think what we have is the empire in Washington and London has outsourced the marketing and PR and the sort of smart power, I would like to call it, has outsourced this responsibility to George Soros's operation. So he's performing this off the books, essentially. And then he's financing it. He could be getting paid back in different ways. It's difficult to say. I don't know.
That's what I was going to ask you is, so presumably there would be a personal benefit on his part as to why he would be so interested in this. And as I was reading about this, I was reminded of those stories. I mean, if you remember back in the mid 2000s, late 2000s, there was, I think, even a movie The name of it escapes me. I think Jake Gyllenhaal's in it, called Rendition. And we were hearing all these tales of CIA rendition. Well, it was curious to me, and maybe you could clear this up, that I think it was around 2010, there were these stories of Syria is the site where the CIA sends people for torture and rendition. And it was actually the Open Society Institute that was promoting that story. Why do you think that might be? Was this actually just sort of made up so that 2010 or so, the Open Society Institute could kind of prepare the way for this to make, Assad and Syria look like villains? Was this an earlier version of the false flag?
I don't know for sure, but what I do know, what I can say, is that countries like Libya and like Syria had diplomatic channels open with Washington and its allies, and had tried and worked to cooperate as much as possible on a number of things, and maybe to their detriment as well. However, with regards to George Soros and the NGO complex, they managed to penetrate Syria in the kind of the neoliberal wave that washed up on the shores of Syria in sort of the late 1990s, early 2000s, after the Lebanese so-called civil war had calmed down, and Syria was in deep economic trouble, and political instability was definitely beckoning for that country. A number of NGOs entered the country, Western NGOs, and to prepare it for perhaps some kind of an IMF rescue package, or there were requirements and expectations of Syria to allow access with some of these organizations, and I think that was the beginning of the end, because what I've found in my research is many of these organizations are basically they're intelligence gathering operations, and they're also social networks. When I say social network, I'm not talking about Facebook or Twitter. I'm talking about what they represent on the ground, which is social networking. And these are designed, these NGOs and what we call third sector organizations are basically designed to construct a parallel state, which they've road tested in the West. In Britain, they call it the big society. In the United States, they might call it something else. But it's basically a shadow state. It's constructing shadow state organizations that run parallel with the real state. So when you can collapse the real state, then these are already manned and staffed, and they just move in to fill the vacuum. This is the design, and this is what they've attempted to do in Syria from the beginning. And so then these groups and these people involved with them, not just Syrians, but Westerners who were interacting with them, would all of a sudden manifest on Facebook when the trouble sort of began in 2011, late 2010 and 2011 in Syria. So this is basically, this smart power complex, formerly soft power, now smart power. This is essential in basically getting the groundwork laid for basically toppling a country.
Right.
And a lot of countries have gotten wise to it. Obviously, Syria is wise to it now, but Egypt has raided the offices of NGOs and kicked out most of the major ones from the United States. They've arrested, prosecuted people. Russia has deemed them as unfriendly. List of unfriendly organizations not allowed to operate in Russia, including, I believe, the National Endowment for Democracy and Open Society as well. So, people are wise to it. Hungary is also very skeptical now of these organizations. They might have trouble operating in Hungary. So these are just subterfuge, agents of subterfuge masquerading in a humanitarian or some sort of social function.
What's interesting, though, that's a great breakdown. And I don't mean to muddy the waters too much, but you'll notice, though, that Open Society Institute will run stories criticizing CIA operations, and then will turn around and do the function to serve the policies that the CIA wants to begin with.
Yeah.
So that kind of throws up some smoke and mirror, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Kind of a diversion, as if, see, they're not going to be they're going to be independent. They're not going to be going along with Washington and government objectives because they're third party, see they're criticizing rendition programs, see they're good guys. But in actual fact, they're going to be working consistently to further Washington's narrative.
Yeah, any statements like that, I would take. I mean, there are people within that organization
Right, yeah.
that are probably allowed to have some level of autonomy, political autonomy, in what they're allowed to say and not say. There are people probably allowed to do that, but I don't really pay too much attention to what they might say. I'm more interested in what they do, and I think most people are. And so with regards to Open Society, they are basically funding and funneling money in the same direction as an organization like USAID, USAID. And USAID is a well-known, fairly proven, often CIA front over many decades, and including today. They are involved in financing and funding a number of dubious organizations, including ones operating in Syria, who are masquerading as humanitarian outfits, like the White Helmets, for instance. And USAID allows the government to do this over the table because it's seen as aid, and they'll fund a number of opposition organizations, people, groups, and so forth. In the case of the White Helmets, it's meant to be, the Syrian civil defense is an interesting case study. It's been packaged as a first responder going in and fishing babies out of the rubble after the regime, the evil Assad regime, has been bombing and killing his own people. And so they got their seed funding from the UK Foreign Office. They were headed up and started by a graduate of Sandhurst, a top NATO military operative in Bosnia. His name is James Lemezurier. And so he started the so-called White Helmets. And so USAID managed to funnel $23 million to them in the last 18 months, I believe. And they've also got money from possibly a number of other similar sources. In total, I think the White Helmets have gotten nearly $100 million in total over the last 3 years. Now, what is $100 million buy? According to what we see, a couple uniforms, a couple of dodgy, cheap vans, and supposedly there's 2,500 members of this volunteer rescue team, which they say are bakers and candlestick makers who have put on the White Helmets to save 40,000 lives, they said, since they've been operating. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, this is a great cover for if you wanted to fund a militia or you wanted to fund a fighting group. This is a brilliant facade. This is a great cover to do. And you just said that's what USAID is. It's masquerading as an aid agency, but it funds and supports a lot of covert activity and has probably many CIA staffers or NSA staffers employed there. So on the ground as well. And I met some of them in my travels in the Middle East who work for USAID, and they say, "Oh well, I'm here to help the local farmers market their agricultural products." And you're looking at this guy's as straight as an arrow. He looks like a fish out of water. Yeah. And you're meant to think I'm meant to think that he doesn't work for the CIA, and he graduated from Brown University, or Yale. Yeah. You know what I mean? What are you doing out here in the sticks of the Middle East? Why? So you're not to help the world. He's not a hippie, Yeah,
humanitarian vacation. Now, yeah. I wanted to ask you about part of the White Helmets campaign was the fake news story that you exposed quite well, that dealing with these made-up hospitals. And this was the run throughout the Western media as justification for, further intervention, I guess, and for Western actions there. But 5 of these so-called hospitals didn't exist.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is part of the PR war, which is to demonize anything that Russia is doing in partnership with the Syrian Arab Army, Syrian military. And so they said Russia's bombing hospitals, shock horror, and we all need to get together and demand they stop. And so in some cases, these hospitals didn't exist. The high-profile one that kicked off last week's George Soros marketing campaign, which is hashtag Aleppo is burning. Everybody's changing their Facebook profiles to a red box. Aleppo is on fire. And this is a multi-million-dollar marketing campaign launched out of the Avaz and Soros and all these same sources that are funding the White Helmets and other similar groups. So this was kicked off by a report that a Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, supported hospitals. So not even their own hospital, but one that they support. In other words, their name is attached to it. And they said it's called Al-Quds. And so we did some research. We couldn't find any of the doctors in Aleppo we spoke to that ever heard of Al-Quds Hospital. So we finally got a photograph of it. And MSF made a statement. They said it was reduced to rubble. We've got a photograph of it from this week standing straight up. There were some sandbags in front of it, of course. So it looks like it was kind of in a fighting zone, but it wasn't reduced to rubble, and it wasn't a hospital. It looks like a building. So at most, it was maybe maybe there was a clinic on the ground floor for fighters. So one can only deduce from the evidence here that MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, is only operating in rebel-held areas, and we know for a fact that terrorism and terrorists groups, Al-Qaeda, is ubiquitous in those areas. So we can only conclude from that MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, must be running triage and doing cleanup, and maybe the White Helmets look like, if there's ever something with regards to rebel areas getting hit or terrorist groups getting hit, al-Nusra front, the White Helmets come in to help clean up, basically, and then take them over to MSF hospital. So this is the terrorist medical operation, basically.
Sure.
Which is being funded by the West, is being supported by Western money to basically run field hospitals for al-Nusra front, because we have photographs of the White Helmets together with al-Nusra. In fact, there is a video of an execution where al-Nusra kills somebody, and then the camera rolls, and the White Helmets go and pick up the body and throw him in the back of a pickup truck. And so, they're being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize this year. Can you believe it? So this is the level of insanity that we are looking at.
Well, I
right now.
Yeah, I've read several pieces that dealt with the history of Doctors with Borders, and that's a dubious institution that's also, like USAID, a front. It was started by top Bilderberg members of the International Crisis Group.
Bernard Kouchner.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's immediately dubious, I would say.
But they've done MSF has done a great job in their PR, because most people, when you say MSF or Médecins Sans Frontières or Doctors Without Borders, they've seen the commercials. That looks like a non-political organization. Like, if you can give to a charity, this is the one, right? Helps people, right?
Right.
So most people will say they're non-aligned, right? But that is basically shows you how successful their public relations department is. And in fact, there's a World Humanitarian Summit, which was scheduled this week, and MSF has just pulled out. And they're saying the reason for this, they're not going to go to the World Humanitarian Summit because their hospitals are getting hit. So you noticed MSF was in the news a couple months ago. One of their hospitals got hit by a U.S. airstrike in Afghanistan. And this was in Kunduz, in the Taliban-held area. And this was all the rage. It was all over Fox. It was all over CNN. Oh, what a big crisis. And when this happened, I was like, well, okay, this is interesting. But, the Air Force, someone screwed up. They didn't get the coordinates, right? So they said. But here we have basically MSF, again, operating in jihadi areas, working with jihadi fighters. And we see the same thing in Syria. So I'm wondering, are they contracted to basically look after the Mujahideen in these various hotspots around the world? Is that their new role? Maybe it wasn't their role before, but that is definitely what's going on in Aleppo. I think the facts are very clear. Okay, I can't speculate about Afghanistan, but it made them look like the victim in their statement by their head this week, saying that she's pulling out of the World Humanitarian Summit and basically saying MSF is the victim. But I think it appears to me the MSF is operating illegally in Syria. They've snuck in. They're working in terrorist-held areas. They have been in I believe in Ghouta as well, where the fake chemical weapons attack took place. They played a role in that as well. They were involved in that suburb of Damascus. Again, snuck into the country, operating illegally. So this is basically a covert organization. They're not over the table, and they are not nonpartisan, because I'm sorry, when you're running triage for sectarian, militant, or terrorist groups, then you are partisan.
Well,
you are taking a side.
Absolutely. And that brings me to my next question that you mentioned there with these chemical weapons. Now, as I understand, the reason Aleppo is important from a logistics standpoint is that it's a hub, according to Vanessa Beeley's article, for NATO-U.S. terror brigades. And so some, I believe, 1,000 or so chemical weapons plants have been stolen by Turkey, and this is to aid in some sort of deal between Turkey and Qatar. So what I'm wondering is, was the made-up news story about Assad and the supposed chemical weapons attacks on his people, was this really just a ploy to basically steal the chemical weapons, the chemical plants?
Yeah, so there's been a deliberate strategy. In Aleppo is a very good example, where whole factories, in other words, when the rebels arrive, or we call them rebels just for, for the reader's ease, but really when the terrorists arrive, they basically will take over, close down, the factories. And in some cases in Aleppo, they were dismantled, literally. Either the machinery was blown up, and any other movable or anything that was portable was taken into Turkey. So basically, the whole what this is the bigger strategy, and you have to be able to look a little further down the timeline to understand what you're looking at here. This is the dismantling of the manufacturing sector,
right.
And they did the same thing in Lebanon, in a lot of places as well. So what it does afterwards, so the three objectives are, if you want to destroy a country, and you want that country to be helpless or subservient after the war finishes, you need to destroy as much property as you can. Okay, you need to create a housing crisis. You need to create security crisis that's pretty constant, that requires some sort of foreign occupying military force or UN-led force or something to help with the policing. And you also need to destroy the manufacturing sector of that country. Mm-hmm. Now, if you do that after the war, the country will then be dependent on foreign imports. And this is where it gets easy for people like the United States, because they've got their guys there.
Okay.
They've got grants from USAID. The IMF are lining up with some money as well. The UN's got some money, the World Food Program, and everything's coming from the outside, be it textiles, be it any sort of manufactured goods, be it food, whatever is. In the case of Aleppo, there was chlorine factories, and so these would be used to manufacture large chlorine tablets, which would be used by city and municipal bodies in order to sanitize the water at water treatment plants. Okay, it's fairly standard. And early on in 2013, the beginnings of Al-Nusra Front, which was also called Front Victory, and the elements coming from Iraq, from that confab, they took over a chemical weapons factory, used the chlorine tablets, and rigged them with explosives to create a very crude chlorine bomb and crude chlorine munitions. And then they were launched, and then the people in Britain and the United States jumped on it and said Assad was using chemical weapons against his own people. At 21st Century Wire, we were probably the first person in English to break that story in March 2013. And if no one paid much attention to it, it's still there. You can still see it. But that allowed our readers anyway to see the trend at the beginning, that this idea of a red line, like Assad, if he crosses the red line, or if anyone crosses the red line in Syria and uses chemical weapons, the U.S. will be forced to intervene militarily. Mm-hmm. So this was basically a parlor trick. And so they worked really hard to create a chemical weapons incident and ideally to blame it on the Assad and Syrian army, because even though they drew a red line that applied to both the rebels and the Syrian government, the public wouldn't back an intervention if the rebels used chemical weapons, obviously. Mm-hmm. So what they did is they constantly tried to muddy the waters. They had all these extravagant investigations and fact-finding papers in Britain and the U.S. to try to basically gin up a case for chemical weapons. And they did this for 2 years. And everybody, including the President of the United States, still to this day,
they still say it, yeah.
They'll still repeat and parrot the lie. I even saw John Brennan, the head of the CIA. Can you imagine? He should be the one who knows everything about anything. And he's on with Chuck Todd on national TV saying Assad's used chemical weapons against his own people, when in fact it's the rebels, the so-called rebels, the terrorists being armed and supported by Brennan's organization, the CIA, who are launching chemical weapons and lobbing them at civilians. And so it's the complete opposite of what he's saying to the American public. Yeah. And this is interesting because the CIA doesn't normally they aren't so cozy with the media on Sunday morning. This is not the role of the Central Intelligence Agency until this administration has tried to refurbish the CIA as a kinder and gentler and more engaged with the public type organization.
So this Mockingbird out in the open.
Out in the open. And this requires the head of the organization, which is the figurehead, not the head, but the figurehead, to go on and lie to the American public. Which before they didn't have to do that directly. They would only have to lie if they were dragged in front of the Church Commission or, one of these congressional or Senate hearings or something like this. Then they'd have to go and lie to that committee, or they could plead the fifth or do an Oliver North and maybe not say much and claim that it's classified. But now they literally come on national TV directly to the people and lie to them. And I think this is the degrading. To me, this is the degradation of the Central Intelligence Agency as a respected group of analysts, and now it's just basically a tool of the State Department and exists in Hollywood, in perpetuity in Hollywood. But in reality, it's just doing the country, it's doing the empire's dirty business out in the open now.
Another question I have, okay, so as I was reading about this, if you go back to the 1949 coup in Syria, which was organized by Miles Copeland and others in the CIA for the support of Arab nationalism at that time, and the reason that occurred was that a year later there was the erection of the Trans-Arabian Pipeline. So the whole purpose of the coup was to remove left-leaning factions or the left-leaning government for, at that time, an Arab nationalism that the CIA hoped would be amenable to a pipeline. And so what I'm curious about is, surely Syria factors into this in terms of geopolitics and energy in a big way. What might be the purpose for Soros and others having such an interest in terms of energy in this region?
Well, for George Soros, and we talked earlier about what is the personal payback for a guy like George Soros. And if you look at George Soros's career, he's a speculator, he's an investor, and if you know in advance how the game, right, how the pieces are going to fall, you know where to put your money, because you can't you have to line up your money and your assets, and you have to do things ahead of time. In fact, you have to have the project ready to go. You have to have the project done. This is how business really works, by the way. For people in business know what I'm talking about. You have to have the project pretty much done before you get the green light, because the time it takes to basically develop it, that means that you don't have the element of surprise on your side in terms of getting the monopoly that you might need. You might end up having to compete with too many local or consortiums, for instance. And so with regards to a pipeline, there would be a pipeline running from Qatar carrying natural gas, running right up through the middle of Syria, through Aleppo into Turkey, and then over to the Mediterranean.
That's what I was going to say. So this was the reason why Turkey, and what we read with Erdogan and his son benefiting from oil in Syria, correct?
Yes, yeah, Bilal Erdogan, yeah. So
A deal with Qatar, and that's why Qatar also had some relevance to the taking over these chemical weapons, or these chemical factories.
yeah, well, I think with regards to taking over the chemical factories, that's part of it. It's really to, like I said before, the main thing is to dismantle the manufacturing sector, to completely cripple the economy for the next, 30 years or something like that. That's the number one objective.
Mm-hmm.
And this means also that people won't be coming back, people, because their jobs are gone basically. So if they fled to Turkey or Europe for safe haven or brighter futures, they won't be coming back because it's done basically. It's gone. And Lebanon experienced this, and you can see this firsthand when you go there. I think hundreds of thousands of people left the country in the 1970s and 80s to go to Australia, to go to South America, to Mexico, to the United States, to Europe, and most of them, in fact, did not come back.
Well, and I might add too, with the NATO-supported right-wing groups in Europe that constantly bitch about refugees, well, it's the CIA, NATO aided terror in Syria that causes refugees.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt, that is the cause. All they talk about is the effects of the migrant crisis, and no one wants to talk about the cause. And meanwhile, they're trying to fast track Turkey into EU membership now, which is, to me, incomprehensible, considering the role that Turkey has played in the destabilization of the region, and then wanting to basically put an EU border along Syria, Iraq, Armenia. I mean, can you believe this is what they're doing? And Iran. So if Turkey is in the EU, basically the EU will share a border with all of those countries. I mean, it's unreal. If you consider they have a complete porous border, the majority, thousands and thousands of Islamic terrorists.
It's not Europe.
camping out in Syria, just going over the border as and when, and weapons and cash and oil coming back over, being sold on the black market. I mean, Turkey.
You've been listening to the first half of my interview with Patrick Henningsen. To hear the full talk, go to JaysAnalysis.com and subscribe for $4.95 a month, where you get access to my full lectures, talks, and interviews. Also, check out my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which you can pre-order from my website at the links. As well, check out Jamie Henshaw's Hollywood Mind Control, also, which can be purchased from the links at Jay's Analysis. Thank you for listening, and be sure to listen to Hour 2.